Hi, everyone, and welcome back. So this week, I decided I wanted to put out a podcast episode that I recorded last year with Dr. Janina Fisher because it was so incredibly helpful. There was so much information in this episode, and I thought that for those who haven't heard it, they'll have an opportunity to hear it. And for those hearing it a second time, I know even myself, I found it so helpful. And so for those of you who don't know Dr. Janina Fisher, she is a renowned expert in the field of trauma. She's a psychologist. She is the creator of the trauma-informed stabilization treatment model. And she's written many books, her latest, Transforming the Living Legacy of Trauma. And she's just such an amazing teacher and a pleasure to listen to. I was fortunate enough to be trained with her. And in this episode, we cover why somatic healing is helpful and why it's necessary. We talk about how with trauma we can fragment, and what does that mean? What does that look like? And there's just this episode is really rich. So I really hope that you enjoy this episode. Hi, Janina. Welcome.
Hello.
I am so happy that you are with us today. It's such an honor, and I really appreciate you taking the time.
You are very, very welcome. It's such a critical time.
Yeah, it is. Well, there's so many things I would love to talk to you about. A lot of people know that you're going to be on the podcast, and they can't wait to hear. So I really try to think of, okay, what would be the most helpful questions? And I kind of planned some, but I will ask you some questions, and then we can just, if you want to add anything more to it that you think could be helpful, by all means. So the first question I have for you is, can you share with us how it is that we remember trauma less in words and more with our feelings and our bodies?
We think that is because, again, obviously there's no way to know, but we believe that the reason for that is that remembering, as we usually do in words, it takes more time than remembering instinctively. So if you think back to the days of the cavemen and women, it would have been adaptive for them to remember with their bodies and emotions, because so that they didn't have to think. Again, the world of primitive man was a very dangerous world. And so this adaptation evolved over hundreds and thousands of years that seems to have favored people who remember with their bodies and their feelings. It's obviously very inconvenient in this era to remember with your body and your feelings, because you don't often know why you're feeling the way you're feeling. And it's hard to know, am I having a feeling memory, or am I having a feeling response?
Right. Yeah, I think that's good, because can you talk then a little bit about like implicit memory and how that gets stored in the body?
Well, implicit memory is the technical term for all somatic memories, whether auditory memories, visual memories, gut memories, muscle memory, tactile memory, and also emotional memory without words. And so, again, we don't understand all of the mechanisms, but when something occurs that's overwhelming, that is, traumatic by its very nature, means overwhelming and beyond the capacity to cope. We do know that the thinking brain, the prefrontal cortex, the front section of our brains, goes offline. So the assumption is that over, again, hundreds and hundreds of years, this brain pattern became established. Something overwhelming would happen, the cortex would shut down, and people would only experience the feelings and body reactions, and that's what would get recorded in the brain as memory.
So there's no kind of content, really.
So often, some, have some content. They have a context. I was walking home from the bus stop. I arrived in Iraq and we went to blah, blah. Many people have a context. They may have bits and pieces of verbal memory. They have, pictures, since visual images are part of nonverbal memory. Many people have pictures that they then piece together to say, oh, okay, this was what happened. But we do know, and for 30 years, there have been a lot of writing about traumatic amnesia, which really means amnesia for the verbal memory, not for the feeling memories.
Yeah. And I can kind of get a feel for that, especially for when you're very, very young, toddler, baby, and you don't have the language, but you might have experienced extreme fear and terror, but not have the language. And isn't it true that when we're even older and we experience something that's so overwhelming, like you said, the prefrontal cortex is gone, and so we're kind of just left with these sensations of overwhelm and all of that.
Right, exactly. Yes, but it does make sense, as you say, about why the memory for childhood trauma is even worse than memory for adults, events in adulthood, because children during the first 9 years of life don't remember a whole lot in words. Their long-term memory is much more feeling and body memory.
I'm glad you're saying that, because I think that's going to be really important for people to hear and eye-opening.
Yeah. Yes, I think especially it's very important for parents to know, because so often you ask children, what did you do in school today? And they say, I don't know, which can feel like an evasion if you don't know that little children don't have very limited ability to put experience into words. They can tell you if they had a good day or a bad day, but they might not be able to say, well, first we had circle and then we had reading, etc.
Right. And they might be able to tell you, that a teacher made them feel embarrassed or bad or something like that, because they're remembering the physical or the feelings, the sensations. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. So why is incorporating the somatic piece, the somatic part, important to recovery from trauma?
Because, for many, many years, and I'm sure you and most of your listeners have seen this in magazines, on television programs, where someone says, if you just talk about it, it will be over. And we believed that for many, many years. And, hundreds of thousands of individuals poured their hearts out, told their stories, often many times, and it didn't resolve the trauma. So when the brain scan research revealed that traumatic memory was coded in the brain as primarily in the form of body sensations and emotions, it became clear that if you wanted to resolve trauma, you had to help people resolve the body and emotional memories. So it's what we call in the field, the body keeps the score, which is what Bessel van der Kolk, probably the most prominent leader in our field, has proven over the years.
Yeah. And so incorporating, when you say somatic, can you just maybe give us one little example of what that could look like, incorporating somatic into therapy?
Somatically trained therapists, primarily trained either in a method called sensorimotor psychotherapy or a method called somatic experiencing, focus on the body sensations and undischarged energy. I mean, think if you are, if you're mugged, for example, and you see the mugger coming towards you, and you experience the impulse to run, but you can't act on it because you've got this person threatening you with a weapon. The body holds back the impulse to run instinctively. The brain and the body always seem to choose the safest possible response. Years later, that person who was mugged might still be afraid of going out after dark, might still be afraid of certain kinds of, might be afraid of the neighborhood where the mugging occurred, might be afraid of similar neighborhoods or areas. And so what the somatic therapist does is to help the client to, we call it, go back to that time, right? Go back to that moment, not to the whole story, but go back to that moment that you first sensed that something wasn't right. Go back to the moment you first saw this mugger approaching you. And then we help clients feel the body reaction. And there are various somatic techniques that help people discharge all that energy. Imagine holding the energy of wanting to run and not being able to for 20, 30 years. That's a lot of energy. So people need to discharge it until their bodies relax and they feel a sense of safety. And again, I am simplifying very sophisticated techniques just to kind of give you a flavor of it. And these techniques can be used on children as well as adults, which is wonderful because children actually, I think, do better even than adults working somatically.
Yeah, I just love that because all of this, because in the the time that I was looking for help, and maybe some of the listeners that are a little bit quote unquote older, it was all about talking. I think you said that, you alluded to that. talking it through and we're seeing now how the trauma, the overwhelm was not in the cognitive mind. It was in the physiology that was just the sensations and the overwhelm and all of that. So I love that this is addressing that, and it's giving you an opportunity to complete or do what you wanted to do back then. Really
Right.
amazing.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And have you seen in your practice or with some of the therapists that you may teach where they have seen profound changes in people once they are able to revisit that and mobilize or do what they needed to do then?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, without question.
Fabulous.
And and there are many ways that we can use somatic interventions to calm anxiety, to lift depression, to really help people deal with a multitude of the different kinds of stressful emotions we can all have.
Wonderful. So thank you for that. What does it mean to have a neurobiological approach to understanding trauma?
It means really what we've been talking about. It means a therapist who is familiar with the effects of trauma on the mind, the body, the nervous system, and can help the individual overcome those somatic effects.
And people are, always so surprised. I mean, it's getting a little bit better where, they may be working with a therapist that doesn't have that kind of understanding of the biology piece, the physiology, and is kind of stuck in the heads and the thoughts. And
Absolutely.
yeah.
And I had a perfect example of that just a couple weeks ago. I consulted to a gentleman who had very early trauma in the first 2 years of life. And his therapist kept saying, "You have to tell the story. You have to tell the story." And the client kept saying, "I can't tell a story from before I had the words," right? These experiences happened when I was a baby, right? They didn't happen when I was old enough to remember things in words. So it's very important.
Yes, yes. And, I know that, CBT can be helpful in a lot of ways, but I know for myself, they were really pushing that when I was in the midst of going through a lot of PTSD symptoms, a while ago. And it just, I couldn't be still enough. And I don't want to say I was shamed, but it was like, well, you've got to do it. You've got to do it. And I'm like, but I can't.
Right.
Frustrating. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's unfortunate.
Yeah.
Because CBT is the easiest type of therapy to research. A lot of research has been done on its effectiveness. And as a result, it's probably the most popular form of treatment worldwide. Not popular with clients, it's popular with health systems.
Yes.
Right? Because it can be delivered short term. And it's just a shame because so many people say, well, it did help me, get out of bed and start doing a little more, but it didn't resolve my depression. It just helped me function.
Yeah. Yeah. So, another thing I had for you that I picked up from some of your readings, and many people find it extremely hard to have any self-compassion towards themselves. Often they feel this kind of hatred or disgust when you tell them, oh, just have some self-compassion. They, they don't know what that means. So how can you start to help them with that?
Well, I think by understanding that compassion, self-compassion particularly, is a luxury in a dangerous world. And for children, an abusive environment is a dangerous world. It isn't that sometimes abuse happens. It's that every day the child feels in danger. Um, and self-compassion is not essential to survival. It's essential for healing, but it's not essential to survive. And so if you think about how the mind and body have adapted to the requirements of survival, it makes sense that compassion is not a priority for most trauma survivors. Mm-hmm. So it depends in part on the training of the therapist. In England, Paul Gilbert is a psychologist who teaches self-compassion as a set of skills. So he doesn't ask people to have compassion for themselves. He says, if you want to feel better, you have to learn these skills. And that seems to be a much easier way for many people to increase their self-compassion. Mm-hmm. I teach people to do that by imagining the child they once were, or the helpless victim they once were, and having compassion for that child or that individual, which is that's very much easier than asking people to have compassion for themselves. Interesting.
I missed the last part that you said. You started to say that you have people, and then I missed it. So how do you have them to have self-compassion?
So I ask them to have compassion for the child they once were. So rather than saying, when you feel fearful, can you have compassion for yourself rather than judgment? I ask them to imagine that child who was always afraid. And I try to help them have compassion for that child. And one of the lovely things about most survivors of trauma that I've worked with is that they have tremendous compassion for animals, children.
Yep.
And so I try to help them use that compassion for small children, helpless creatures, to have compassion for that child that suffered so much.
Yes.
And then when they say, you're asking me to have compassion for myself, I say, no, I'm not asking you to have compassion for yourself. I'm asking you to have compassion for that little kid who was so scared all the time and didn't deserve to be frightened all the time. And then they say, oh, okay, that's all right.
So you're shifting a little bit, a sort of a little bit of a separation between sort of their adult self. We're getting into one of my next questions, but their kind of adult maybe a little bit more, I forgot the term you used. Was it the show up as you are now adult, or but there's that, and then the younger part.
Yeah, I mean, we can call the person we are today by many names. We could call it our adult selves. I call it the going on with normal lifestyle.
Yes, that's it.
Right.
I love that.
Right. Because even children in very, very abusive settings still get up in the morning and they get dressed and they go to school and they try to learn their multiplication tables. So we all have that instinct to keep on going on. And so that's one way to think of it. Many people think of that going on with life self as faking it or as a false self, which is really a terrible disservice because again, keeping on going is an instinct. And I'm sure many people can relate to it. It's the instinct that keeps parents going when they haven't had more than 2 hours sleep at a time for weeks. It's what, keeps us going under I'm thinking of, at the present moment, I'm thinking of people in healthcare. It keeps them working double shifts, even though they're ready to fall asleep on their feet. We all have that instinct to keep on going. And it's not fake at all. It's actually very difficult.
Yeah, and I see that as resilience, because the fact that we are moving towards, we're moving, and we're alive, and that's really something.
Yeah, and it's so important that people don't mistake that keeping on going for pretending, because it is definitely, pretending would be much less work. And I always say to people, if we pretended, we'd still be ourselves, because I would pretend differently from you, and you would pretend differently from this person or that person, right? I mean, human beings are still themselves, even when they're pretending to be something else.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that's true. So, this will bring me to my next question, since we're kind of, talking about these different parts, the child. You like to use a combination of IFS, which is like parts work, attachment, somatic, and inner child. Can you talk a little bit about why this is helpful in the treatment of trauma?
Well, I think it's a way of thinking that can be useful for all of us. Right. And there are certain theoretical models. Internal family systems is one, but there are others as well that understand human beings as consisting of many parts.
Right.
And which actually tends to make more sense of what we experience, because we can be very, very patient and then lose our temper, and or we can be somebody who's impatient, and then suddenly find patience. We have different sides of us. We have sides of us that are more compassionate, more critical, more insecure, more confident. And I think that normalizes that we're not like homogenized milk, right? We have different sides to us.
Yes.
And it helps. I mean, this is the approach I wrote about in my book, healing the fragmented selves of trauma survivors. It's a way of working that understands distress as a communication from young wounded parts of ourselves, so that the adult or normal life self can have compassion for that part that is depressed or anxious or self-doubting.
Yeah. And I love that, because that part never got the attention or attunement, and it gives the opportunity of, since we can't go back to our past, to attune in the present when we're actually feeling the distress.
Right. And when we have a brain capable of helping ourselves heal that distress, which we don't have when we're little, which is why children rely on the brains of their parents, ideally.
Do you ever have clients that will say, well, I don't think my present day self can do that? Like they feel like because they didn't get it as a child, that their adult present day self won't be able to do it.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that idea has also been perpetuated in television and movie programs and, magazine articles, this idea that if you didn't get it from somebody outside of yourself, you're not going to have it, which is just not true. Because we have many people who were never parented as children who are excellent parents. And and people who had very loving and stable parents who struggle to parent. It isn't so simple. And it's not, the fact that we have a human brain, and we're the only animal to have it, that can imagine experiences we've never had and feel like we're having them now. We have a human brain that can feel sadness in one part of the brain and can feel compassion in another part of the brain, which is it's a very wonderful capacity we have. We all have the ability to talk to ourselves, even though that's been made fun of, right? Talking to yourself, you're crazy. In fact, we know that it works to talk ourselves off the ledge, to reassure our fears, to, give us confidence. So, it's really a wonderful thing that the human brain is capable of.
Yeah. Yes. So let's see. Okay, this might be a little bit of a big question, but you can answer it as you want. How do we become fragmented, and what does that mean? Because we can hear that in the trauma conversation sometimes. So would you be able to clarify a little bit, what does it mean, fragmented?
Well, what it means is that we all have brains. We talk about the brain, we talk about memory, but in fact, brain scientists have found that what we call the brain actually consists of different structures or groups of structures, each of which serve a different purpose and are connected through what are called neural networks. Think of telephone lines going between these different structures. So we have a brain that is compartmentalized. And especially when we're young and under traumatic stress. So think of children who are profoundly neglected, who are abused, who are growing up in the midst of wartime, or in the midst of terrorism. That tendency of the brain physically to be compartmentalized can become a way to fragment. So those structures that normally communicate with each other can stop communicating with each other and just operate independently. And that's essentially what happens when we fragment. The part of the brain that's able to think becomes fragmented and separated from the part of the brain that feels, right? The part of the brain that holds our experience of being three can become separate from the part of the brain that holds the experiences of when we were 10. The part of the brain that is responsible for anger can become split off or compartmentalized from feelings of sadness and hurt.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of fragmentation is very, very, very helpful in a dangerous world. So children can learn to think but not feel. They can learn to feel and not think. And actually they don't have to learn it. The brain does it for them. The brain compartmentalizes anger so the child never looks angry, stops tears so the child never cries, right? So all of this fragmenting helps us to survive and keep going on.
So I'm sorry. No, you go ahead.
And if children are growing up in what we call a chronically traumatic environment, that compartmentalization or splitting can get more and more severe until you have a version of what we used to call multiple personality disorder.
Are you there?
Yes, I'm still here. Are you still here?
I'm here. It's because I got a call, excuse me, in between, and then thought you went away. So yeah, you were the last thing I heard was multiple personalities. Isn't that what they call now, more of a severe type of disassociation?
Right. So now it's called dissociative identity.
Yes.
But many people are more familiar with the idea of multiple personality disorder. Right. So it's how we label it is really more who's doing the labeling. But again, the idea of having a dissociative disorder is that the parts become more and more separate from one another and more independent.
Mm-hmm. So I don't know if you want to share a little bit, maybe a little example of what that could look like.
Sure. Let me think for a moment. So, well, I'm thinking of a couple of different individuals. Um, one person, one of my clients, who I talked to this morning, we had a telephone session because now, of course, in the pandemic, we're not seeing people face to face.
Right.
And she talked about how she was feeling completely lost and purposeless, and she was feeling very self-critical, right? I'm doing nothing with my life. I'm bored, I'm lonely. And so uh, I said to her, be curious about these parts of you who are blaming you for the limitations imposed by COVID. And as we began to explore this sense of, I mean, we certainly all are going a little stir crazy. It's very normal to feel very tired of the COVID restrictions, very tired of the house, very tired of the limited number of things we can all do. But she was feeling as if her whole life had been a waste, as if she was failing, had no purpose. And so we began to be curious about what parts of her were telling her that her life was a waste, and what parts of her were uncomfortable and kind of agitated by this enforced lack of activity. And I should add, she lives out in the country, by a river. She lives in an absolutely beautiful, beautiful place where you can walk and swim and just sit out and enjoy the beauty of the natural world. A place where many people would be happy to be self-quarantined. And then she suddenly realized, she said, oh, this part of me that says this is unbearable is the part of me that's used to some crisis. And this is, it's really true when we're self-quarantining. COVID is less of a crisis, and it's more boring, right? And so she said, oh, it's a part of me that is uncomfortable with my not being in crisis, right? Because all my life I've been just at the brink of disaster, and now I'm just sitting around waiting for this virus to be done. And then she recognized that part of her was saying, you've wasted your life, as a very critical part of her that believed even when she was a child that if she could just do something important and visible in the world, nobody would hurt her because they only hurt unimportant people. That was her childhood belief. So by the time we had finished, she'd been able to separate out the belief that her life was a waste and had no purpose, and see that that was her critical self-doubting part. She could separate out the part of her that was actually physically uncomfortable with the enforced activity restriction. And she could appreciate, and she could say, I think after we finish, I'll go swimming in the river. Because it's a beautiful day. It's not too hot, and I don't have anything I have to do. So often, if we can separate out feelings of distress and know them or notice them as a part, it becomes easier to find the part of us that is okay.
I really like that. Yes.
Yeah, because at most moments, there is a part of us that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah. And I could hear that she just, her whole life was bad. Her whole life was a waste. And through this parts work, you were able to just identify, hey, wait a minute, there is a part of you that's feeling this way. And then there's another part of you that, might want to go to the lake and jump in. So I love that.
Right. And it's also very nice because if you say to someone in distress, there's a part of you that is okay, many people experience that as invalidating their distress.
Yeah.
But when we separate out all the parts that are distressed, then they're left with the realization, oh, yeah, and I'm actually okay right now. Or a part of me can see that actually I'm very lucky to be restricted to a beautiful country setting with its own body of water in which I can swim.
I really like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fabulous. So that is a little bit of the kind of work that you do with your clients and that you teach.
Yes. So that's the work I wrote about in my book, and that I primarily teach other therapists to make use of.
Oh, that's great. So is there anything else you want to add to the conversation? Maybe something I didn't ask that you think might be helpful for people to know?
Well, I think just a validation that we're living in very traumatic times, and that the feelings of anxiety right now are are very unpleasant but perfectly normal. And that the more we notice our reactions, whether it's boredom, anxiety, depression, anger, even, the more we notice those responses as survival-oriented responses. So anxiety keeps us aware of the risks, right? It's the anxiety that reminds us to use hand sanitizer or to wear a mask or to keep a social distance. Right? It's the it's the anger that can give us energy. I'm not going to let this virus beat me down. So whatever emotions people are having, they're your body and brain's attempt to help you through. And I think when we understand our reactions that way, we don't kind of fall into the trap of believing that the feelings are predictors of the future. So if you're feeling kind of hopeless, it doesn't mean a prediction that the future is going to be hopeless. It means that your body is saying, okay, I submit, but I don't like it. And many people may be feeling that way because right now, submitting to the restrictions is a very healthy choice, although not a pleasant one. It's a very healthy choice. So we call it befriending these emotional reactions as the best our brains and bodies can do to keep us safe. Makes it a little bit easier.
Yeah, definitely. I love that. Okay, well, I was wondering if you could share with us. I know that you have, is it a webinar coming up, or just share with us what you have coming up? If people would like to participate in any of your trainings. I hear through the grapevine you have a new book that's going to be coming out. Anything you'd like to share with us?
I actually have a webinar program starting tomorrow morning called Inside Outside Threat, and it's focused on what we're all dealing with right now and how to use the somatic techniques in particular to help us through this very challenging time and to help others, right? Whether we're parents or therapists, or just human beings on this planet, we all or most of us have people that need our help. And so the webinar really addresses how to help ourselves and help others. If any of your listeners are interested, probably, I'm just trying to think how to get information about it. The thing to do is to have any listeners who are interested send an email to me at Dr. J.J. Fisher, DrJJ FISHER at gmail.com. I also I'm also have courses coming up that will be on my website, janinafisher.com. And my new book is due out in October. It's a workbook called Transforming the Living Legacy of Trauma. And it was written for trauma survivors and their therapists. It can be used with or without a therapist. But I'm really looking forward to it coming out.
Oh, so are we. So are we. Some of the trainings that you have, are they specifically for just therapists, or are they open to clients or other professions, or just people that want to learn about trauma?
The webinar that starts tomorrow is open to both therapists and anyone else, because what is happening right now applies to all of us, regardless of our professions. Most of my courses and trainings are geared more toward therapists.
Okay.
But often, many of them don't have prerequisites. So I find people who are just interested in trauma because of their own experience or that of family members, they often join these courses and find them useful.
Yeah, and that's what I was wondering, if they can, without being a therapist, if they could partake in it.
Oh yes, for most of them. I don't know that I can tell you exactly which ones are open to anyone, but the best way to find out is on my website. Each one will have a link, and you can just check to see whatever it says.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, perfect. And I'll put your email that you said, the Gmail, on the show notes as well as your website. So, Janina, thank you so much for spending this time with us. We really, really appreciated it.
You're very welcome, Monique. This is such a great service to be providing for people.
Okay, thank you again. Take good care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye. To find out more about my trauma recovery coaching options, you can visit my website at www.cptsdcoach.com.